Do you remember those side dishes that didn't just fill a plate? They brought the whole family together. You know the ones, passed down in stained cookbooks, handwritten on index cards, or folded inside your mama's favorite magazine. They weren't flashy, but they turned everyday meals into something worth sitting down for. Somehow, over time, they just faded away. But today, we're bringing them back. Collard greens with ham hock. There was a time when a pot of greens bubbling on the back burner meant it was going to be a good day. You didn't rush it. Just let it simmer low and slow with a ham hock that had more flavor than most spice racks. It wasn't about the recipe, it was about the rhythm. Rinse, chop, and let it cook until the leaves were tender and the broth, what we called pot liquor, was rich enough to dip a slice of cornbread in. Some folks added vinegar, others a splash of pepper sauce. But one thing was for sure, it brought everyone to the table. These days, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone cooking them from scratch. But once upon a time, greens like these were the heart of a good meal. 7-layer pea salad. Back when Tupperware was queen of the fridge, there was always a spot reserved for this colorful masterpiece. 7 layers, each one stacked with care. Crisp lettuce, sweet peas, chopped red onion, shredded cheese, crumbled bacon, and hard-boiled eggs, all sealed under a thick blanket of mayo. It chilled overnight, and when it hit the table the next day, it stole the show. You didn't stir it. No, ma'am. You served it with a straight edge to keep those layers pristine. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like it. Cool, crunchy, salty, creamy. It hit every note. Nowadays, folks reach for store-bought potato salad, but back then, this was the cold dish that meant someone cared enough to layer it just right. Spinach cheese squares. These tasty squares had a way of showing up at just about every gathering where someone wore a brooch and brought a church bulletin. These buttery, cheesy bites looked innocent enough, but one taste and you'd be hooked. Made with thawed frozen spinach, sharp cheddar, a couple of eggs, and seasoned stuffing mix, they baked into golden perfection. Cut into neat little squares, they were served on platters, with toothpicks like they were fancy, though we all knew they were just an excuse to eat butter and cheese under the guise of greens. You don't see these much anymore, but once upon a time, they were the secret weapon of every well-prepared hostess. Green bean casserole. You knew it was a proper meal when this dish made its way to the table. Green beans, cream of mushroom soup, and those crispy canned onions on top. It was dependable, like your aunt, who always brought a gallon of sweet tea and a story about someone you hadn't seen in years. You didn't need to be a chef to make it, just someone who knew their way around a can opener and a casserole dish. It wasn't glamorous, but it had its place, especially on Sundays and holidays. And let's be honest, the best part was always the crunchy topping. Country potato cakes. Leftover mashed potatoes didn't go to waste, not when there was a skillet nearby. You'd mix them with a little flour, maybe a beaten egg, toss in some chopped onion or whatever cheese was hanging around, and shape them into patties. Then came the sizzle, golden, crisp edges in a hot pan, sometimes with a little bacon grease if you were lucky. Served with a fried egg or a dab of ketchup, they turned leftovers into something that felt brand new. No one really writes recipes for these. They were just passed down by watching, tasting, and knowing when it felt right. That's probably why you don't see them much anymore. But once, they were a quiet little star of the weekend table. Southern macaroni and cheese. Back then, macaroni and cheese didn't come from a box. It came from memory. There was no powdered packet or squeeze pouch, just elbow noodles, whole milk, and a whole lot of cheese. And not just any cheese. Folks used sharp cheddar, the kind that gave it some bite, and often added a couple eggs to bind it into a rich, baked casserole with a golden crust on top. Sometimes there was evaporated milk, sometimes a splash of hot sauce, depending on who made it. You knew it was ready when you heard it bubbling in the oven and the top started to brown just enough to make that first scoop the best one. It wasn't a side dish, so much as a love letter in a Pyrex dish. These days, you'll find it as a pre-made tray at the grocery store, but it doesn't hold a candle to the kind that made your cousin fight for the corner piece. Fried okra. There's something downright satisfying about the sound of okra sizzling in a cast-iron skillet. Bite-sized, golden, and crispy on the outside, with just enough tenderness inside. They were the snack you didn't know you were craving until the bowl was empty, and you had to eat it fast, too, because it never lasted long once it hit the table. Whether it was tossed in cornmeal, seasoned with salt and pepper, or given a dusting of flour, fried okra was the kind of side dish that made you forget all about the main course. Some folks turned their noses up at okra because of the slime, but once it was fried right, even the skeptics gave in. You don't see it much outside old family kitchens or roadside diners anymore, but one bite, and it's like being back at your grandma's house, standing barefoot on a linoleum floor, sneaking a hot piece before supper. Hush puppies. These weren't just bread, they were crispy, golden promises straight out of the fryer. Hush puppies were the kind of side dish that showed up whenever something else was frying. Fish, chicken, even catfish nuggets. You'd mix cornmeal with a little flour, egg, chopped onion, maybe a pinch of sugar depending on whose kitchen you were in, then drop them by the spoonful into hot oil until they puffed up and browned. The outside was crunchy, the inside tender, and they were best eaten right away, still warm and steaming. Legend says they got their name from folks tossing them to the dogs to quiet them down. But honestly, they were so good you'd consider tossing one to your brother just to get him to hush. These days, you might spot a sad version on a buffet line, but back then, hush puppies were homemade and handled with care. Corn pudding. Sweet, creamy, and almost custard-like, corn pudding was one of those dishes that walked the line between savory and dessert, and did it beautifully. It wasn't quite a casserole, and it wasn't quite a pie. Made with creamed corn, eggs, milk, a touch of sugar, and sometimes just enough flour to hold it all together, it baked into a soft, spoonable side that always got seconds. The top would brown just a bit, creating a delicate crust you didn't dare disturb too soon. These days, most folks wouldn't know corn pudding if it was served to them on their grandmother's china, but back in the day, it was a warm, golden hug from the oven. Tennessee onions. Now this dish was a sleeper hit. Just a few simple ingredients: sweet Vidalia onions, butter, seasoning, and a generous handful of shredded cheese. But the result? Pure magic. You'd slice the onions into thick rings, layer them in a baking dish, drizzle with melted butter, and cover it all with cheese. Served alongside roast beef or pork chops, it wasn't the loudest dish on the table, but it sure was the one people kept scooping more of when they thought no one was looking. Leather britches. Now here's one you don't hear about anymore. Leather britches weren't pants. They were green beans, strung on thread, and dried until they looked like wrinkled old boots, hence the name. Folks would hang them near the stove or in a sunny window until they were leathery and tough. Then come winter, they'd soak them and simmer them with fatback or ham until they were tender again and full of flavor. The result? A bowl of beans with depth, chew, and that unmistakable cooked-all-day taste. They weren't pretty, but they sure were hearty. Back when nothing went to waste, this was how you turned a summer harvest into a winter supper. You'd be hard-pressed to find leather britches outside of an heirloom cookbook now, but once upon a time, they were as common as biscuits on the table. Scalloped potatoes. Before boxed mixes and instant everything, scalloped potatoes meant slicing real potatoes, paper thin, by hand, not mandolin, and layering them with butter, milk, and just enough flour to thicken. Some families added cheese, others didn't. But either way, it baked into a golden, bubbling pan of starchy goodness. The edges would crisp up while the center stayed creamy, and you always knew who'd be first in line for the corners. This was a dish that took time. Time to peel, time to layer, time to bake. But no one ever complained. It was filling, it was comforting. and it could stretch a little meat a whole lot further. Butter beans with ham. There was something simple and satisfying about a pot of butter beans, slow cooked with a leftover ham bone or a chunk of salt pork. They were tender, creamy, and soaked up every bit of flavor you gave them. Some folks called them lima beans, but around our way, they were butter beans, and they were always welcome on the table. You'd cook them low and slow until they almost melted in your mouth, then serve them with cornbread to catch the broth. It wasn't flashy, but it fed your belly and warmed your spirit. Marinated cucumbers and onions. On hot summer days, when turning on the oven felt like punishment, this cool, tangy dish saved the day. Thinly sliced cucumbers and sweet onions were soaked in vinegar, sugar, water, and a pinch of salt and pepper. Sometimes a little dill or celery seed got thrown in for good measure. You'd let it chill in the fridge until everything was crisp, cold, and flavorful enough to make your mouth water just thinking about it. Served in glass bowls or vintage Pyrex, it brought brightness to any plate of meatloaf or fried chicken. Back then, it was just something Mama always had waiting in the fridge. Rice and gravy. There may not be a simpler comfort food than rice and gravy, but don't let that fool you. It was sacred in some households. You'd start with pan drippings from a roast or fried meat, whisk in flour and water or broth, maybe a splash of milk if you had it, and cook it until thick and savory. Ladled over hot rice, it was the kind of dish that brought folks back for seconds, whether they were hungry or not. Leftovers? Rare. It didn't need meat to shine, just a spoon and a soft spot for tradition. Deviled eggs. No picnic, potluck, or Sunday spread was complete without deviled eggs, and you always made extra, because they were the first thing to disappear. Boiled, halved, and filled with a creamy, tangy yolk mixture, every family had their spin. Some added relish, others mustard, paprika, or even a splash of hot sauce. They were simple, but they had pride. Served on glass trays with little egg-shaped divots, they were as pretty as they were tasty. And Lord help the person who tried to bring a store-bought version. These days, they show up mostly on holidays, but once they were a weekly fixture, and folks would judge you on how well you made them. Cornbread dressing. Not stuffing, dressing. And yes, there's a difference. This wasn't shoved in a bird. It was baked in a casserole dish, made with day-old cornbread, chopped onion, celery, and enough sage to make the kitchen smell like fall. Add some chicken broth, maybe a boiled egg or two, and it came out moist, golden, and ready for a spoon. Dressing was more than a side. It was practically a religion in some households, and heaven help the one who switched the recipe. These days, boxed stuffing mixes line the shelves, but real dressing, the kind that made its way to the table at every major gathering, is getting harder to find. Cabbage with bacon. This wasn't the boiled-to-death cabbage you dreaded as a kid. This was sliced thin, tossed in a skillet with bacon grease, and cooked just enough to stay tender with a bit of bite. Add in the bacon crumbles, maybe a splash of vinegar, and a few dashes of pepper, and you had a side dish that held its own. It was hearty, smoky, and cost next to nothing to make. You could stretch it to feed a crowd, or keep it simple for just two. Cabbage may not win beauty contests, but it knew how to show up when times were lean, and leave you full just the same. Pickled beets. You either loved them or pushed them to the side, but pickled beets were always there. Deep red, sweet and tangy, and often served cold in a little dish alongside your plate. Grandma would make them from scratch with vinegar, sugar, cloves, and a little salt. They'd sit in the fridge in glass jars, ready to dress up a meal like ruby red jewels. Pickled beets weren't fancy, but they added color, bite, and a little old-world elegance to a spread. You don't see them much anymore, but back in the day, they were a staple, especially when company was coming. Cheese grits. Creamy, warm, and packed with sharp cheddar, Cheese grits were the kind of side that felt like a warm blanket in a bowl. You stirred them slowly, with patience, and always used real butter. None of that margarine nonsense. Some folks added garlic, others a splash of cream or hot sauce. Whether served with breakfast eggs or beside baked pork chops, cheese grits had range. They weren't just food. They were comfort, history, and hospitality all rolled into one. Green bean and tomato skillet. This was the kind of dish that showed up when the garden was overflowing, and you didn't want anything to go to waste. Fresh green beans, stewed tomatoes, maybe a little onion or garlic, all simmered together in a skillet until they became more than the sum of their parts. Sometimes there was bacon, sometimes a pinch of sugar, always flavor. It wasn't flashy, but it tasted like summertime in a bowl. You served it warm with cornbread, or even spooned it over rice. Back then, it was a go-to, especially when the pantry was low, but the garden was full. Fatback. Maybe not a dish on its own, though some folks ate them as a dish. Either way, you better believe it showed up in plenty of them. Fatback was that slab of cured pork you fried until it crackled, then used the drippings to flavor everything else. Greens, beans, gravy, you name it. Some folks ate it crisp like bacon. Others just wanted the flavor. Either way, it was the original seasoning packet, long before bouillon cubes and boxed broth. It came wrapped in butcher paper, and it sat proudly in the fridge, waiting for its time to shine. You don't see it much in modern kitchens, but ask anyone with roots deep enough, and they'll tell you. Fatback made the meal. Warm turnip green dip with bacon. Now here's one that felt like a bridge between old-fashioned and fancy. You'd sauté chopped turnip greens with bacon, onion, and garlic. Then stir in cream cheese and maybe a little sour cream or Parmesan until it turned into a creamy, savory dip. Served warm with crackers or toast points, it was like spinach dip's sassier cousin. It started showing up in cookbooks during the 1970s when people started experimenting more with appetizers, but the heart of it was still the same: greens, bacon, and comfort. It came from someone's well-worn recipe card. Homemade cheese straws. Long before store-bought snacks filled the pantry, cheese straws were the thing you made when company was coming. A little flour, butter, sharp cheddar, and a dash of cayenne, rolled, cut, and baked until crisp and golden. They were sharp, salty, and just spicy enough to make you want another. Served in fancy tins or stacked neatly on plates, they were as common at baby showers as they were at funeral gatherings. Every aunt had her version, and the good ones disappeared before the punch bowl ran dry. They're still around if you know where to look, but you won't find them in the chip aisle. Southern pimento cheese. This wasn't just a spread, it was a staple. You'd find it tucked between slices of white bread in a lunchbox, scooped into celery sticks at a church potluck, or spooned straight out of the bowl with a Ritz cracker at midnight. Real pimento cheese was made with shredded sharp cheddar, diced pimentos from a little glass jar, a dab of mayo, and just enough black pepper to make you pause. Some folks added cream cheese, others swore by a splash of vinegar or hot sauce. You don't see it much outside the South anymore, but back then, every fridge had a container of pimento cheese waiting patiently, ready to feed whoever came through the door. Corn Dodgers. Corn Dodgers were the original grab-and-go, made from cornmeal, boiling water, and a little fat. They were shaped into patties or logs and baked or fried. Some were crisp, some tender, but all were meant to be eaten by hand. They were often served with beans or stew and dipped into whatever gravy was on the table. Easy to make, easy to carry, and surprisingly filling. They were a working man's side dish and a kid's favorite finger food. Today, they're almost folklore, but the old cookbooks knew you could dodge a lot with a little cornmeal and a hot pan. Cheddar pecan cheese ring with strawberry preserves. This one sounds fancy, but if you grew up in the 70s, you probably saw it at more than a few holiday parties. Sharp cheddar, chopped pecans, mayo, and a touch of cayenne, shaped into a ring mold, chilled, and served with strawberry preserves in the center. Sweet, salty, savory. It didn't make sense until you took a bite, and then it really made sense. It was a Southern living darling, the kind of dish your mom clipped from a magazine and brought out for special occasions. Today, it might sound a little wild, but once upon a time, it was the belle of the buffet table. Red beans and rice. Simple, affordable, filling. That's what red beans and rice was all about. Made with dried beans soaked overnight, cooked with onion, garlic, bay leaf, and if you had it, a little sausage or ham bone for depth. Served over a scoop of fluffy white rice, it was a full meal dressed up like a side dish. You could feed a crowd, clean out the pantry, and still have enough left over for tomorrow. Hot water cornbread. Before measuring cups and oven timers, there was hot water cornbread. You'd mix cornmeal with boiling water and a pinch of salt, then shape it by hand and drop it into hot oil until it turned golden and crisp on the outside, soft on the inside. It was fast, simple, and full of flavor. Perfect with beans, greens, or just a smear of butter. It was the kind of bread you made when you didn't have time or money for a pan of baked cornbread, and somehow it still tasted like something special. Most folks today have never even heard of it. But if you ever had it straight from the skillet, you know it's unforgettable. Homemade banana pudding. No shortcuts, no boxed layers. Just from scratch custard, vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, and a layer of whipped topping, preferably homemade. This wasn't a quick dessert, it was an event. You stirred the pudding until your arm got tired, then built each layer with care, like you were crafting a family heirloom. And once it was done, it barely had time to cool before someone snuck a spoonful from the corner. It was creamy, warm, sweet, and tasted like Sunday. Some people now reach for instant pudding and whipped topping, but the real thing? That came from Grandma's hands and a yellowed recipe card that never failed. There you have it. It's funny how a simple side dish can bring back a whole memory of Sunday dinners, crowded tables, and the people we miss most. Maybe we don't make these recipes every week anymore, but they're still part of who we are. If one of these dishes brought back a smile or reminded you of someone special, leave a comment and tell us about it. And if you know someone who'd love this trip down memory lane, go ahead and share it with them. We've got more forgotten favorites coming soon, so be sure to subscribe and come on back. The kitchen may look different now, but the memories still taste the same.